Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. Just give everybody a moment to come into this webinar, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Patricia Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'll be your producer for today's webinar with PSG Consulting. It's the first Monday of April. And just a few housekeeping remarks before we get started. We've got the chat closed to the audience. We'll be posting announcements there, but if you have any questions or comments, we would love to hear them. You can post them into the little box that says Q&A. Looks like a couple of talk bubbles at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to post your questions at any time, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Paige Gardner.
Hi, and thanks for joining us today as we continue to explore some key voter segments going into 2024. I'm excited about the next two speakers. They have deep knowledge and expertise in understanding some of the most misunderstood voting segments, young voters, and the wide array of voters of color. There are so many myths and misapprehensions surrounding these voters. Assumptions about whether and for whom they will vote have led to strategic errors that have been costly to Democrats and progressives. As we look towards 2024, what can we hope to learn from past voting patterns, and what are the opportunities and challenges we can expect to face with these different voter segments? Let me introduce our speakers. Roshni Nedungadi, I hope I got that right, is a founding partner and chief research officer at HIT Strategies, the leading millennial and minority-owned public opinion research firm in Washington. Roshni's research seeks to find nuance in how Americans, particularly BIPOC individuals and low propensity voters, conceptualize issues during such a polarized environment. She has led expansive multi-phase research projects exploring how people across the United States feel about gun control, mass incarceration, abortion, and other important issues. We'll also hear from Abby Kiesa. Abby is the Deputy Director of Circle, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Circle, part of Tufts University, is a national applied research center focused on supporting youth civic and political engagement. Abby provides leadership for Circle's election strategies, website content, and external communications. She's currently co-leading a research project focused on learning with community partners about structural shifts to grow voters and support K-12 schools and hold the media industry accountable to being a civic institution. Now, she has worked on several major research projects and evaluations while at Circle, as well as on several partnerships to support growing voters and a more equitable electorate. With that, I will turn it over to Roshni.
Thank you so much, Paige, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. Very excited about this. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about three specific areas. The topic prompt, challenges and opportunities going into 2024, was very expansive. So today I want to focus in a little bit on three areas: abortion, crime and public safety, and AAPI voters going into 2024. As Paige said, I am a founding partner and chief research officer at HIT Strategies. We focus on broad electoral research, but also focus in specifically on messaging towards audiences that we refer to as the emerging electorate. So people of color, young voters, young women, LGBTQ, etc., audiences that make up the broad Democratic coalition. So let me share my screen here, and we can get started. So I want to talk to you all about voter enthusiasm and issue priorities. Like I said, focusing on three specific issues and demographics. But first, a little level setting. So electoral composition in 2020, while almost 40% of our Democratic electorate is non-white, we find that a lot of attention is still focused on the 32% of white non-college Democratic voters. How do we speak to them? How do we persuade them to vote for Democrats? And not as much attention is paid to the 39% of voters of color, or even, the 29% of white college voters who while we don't need to persuade them to vote for Democrats in the same way, need a different type of persuasive messaging in order to get them to be fully on board with Democratic candidates and turn out in elections for Democrats and progressive candidates. So thinking a little bit about the 2022 electorate, while most, again, of our 2022 midterm voters were white, most voters of color supported Democrats. So again, strong Democratic base here among voters of color in the 2022 midterm elections. And also would point out that despite the urgency of Roe v. Wade being overturned, a majority of white women in 2022 still voted for Republicans. I believe that Abby will get more into this in her presentation, but our young people of color voters also supported Democrats, whereas we see young white voters behaving a lot more like older white voters than young voters in general. Thinking a little bit about issues and which issues were important here. While inflation and the economy was the #1 issue that folks said mattered to them when deciding how they would vote, abortion was a very close second in the 2022 election. And we saw that a lot, especially in our qualitative research. While it wasn't top of mind for voters when we asked what is an important issue that's going on in your life today, when folks brought up abortion, brought up the Dobbs decision, it was very much an emotional issue for them and very much drove a lot of their voting behavior going into 2022. You can see from the graph on the right side, this is from exit polls post-election. But they asked which one of the following 5 issues mattered the most in deciding how you voted today, and compared to which party those folks voted for. So you can see an overwhelming percentage of people who cared about abortion voted for Democrats, versus an overwhelming amount of people who cared about inflation voted for Republicans. A lot of this has to do with what we've been researching at Hit Strategies with the trust gap. When we ask voters who they trust to make meaningful change on issues that are important to them, they trust Democrats to make change on abortion. They trust Republicans to make change on the economy and on inflation. They trust Republicans more on crime, but they trust Democrats more on gun policy. So essentially, if we are talking about the same issues that Republicans are, if we are only focused on the economy, only focused on crime, we have to have something different to say. Using the same type of moderate message that Republicans use is not persuasive to many of our voters, because they already believe that Republicans are most trustworthy on these issues. We should come up with something new to say, or a more progressive framed message on these issues. So this was particularly highlighted in a lot of qualitative work that we did over the course of last year. Our base Democratic voters, our surge Democratic voters, so those who typically vote in presidential elections but sit out in midterm elections, and particularly our young base voters, were feeling disengaged, disillusioned, and demoralized. They really attributed this feeling to a lack of what they felt was lack of progress on the issues that mattered most to them. And these groups were especially challenging. The quotes from this slide were done right after the Dobbs decision took place, so July 2022. But the young voters that we spoke to, and the Black voters that we spoke to, and the other people of color, were tired of being told to simply vote, and didn't trust Democrats to make action on the issues that they cared about. They wanted to hear what Dems have already done to make progress on their top issues, and what they will continue to do to earn the votes of young people and people like them. So this is kind of setting a background. We have a very disengaged, disillusioned, and demoralized base who really wants to hear about progress on the issues that they care most about from their elected officials. And they've been telling us over and over that they really, one of the reasons why they don't turn out to vote often is just a real lack of feeling like any progress is being made on issues that are important to them. So it'll be important going into 2024 to highlight some of the issues that are important to them and what we are doing to make progress on them. So I want to talk about just a few of those issues. So the role of abortion in 2022 and how it will affect 2024. So this is from a survey that Lake Research Partners did that we collaborated on. But the issue of abortion is really personally important to 8 in 10 voters that we surveyed, with over half who say that it is very important to them. There's kind of a misconception that among older women of color or older women, it's not as important, but this is not true. Across subgroups, across young women, voters under 30, Democrats, non-college and college-educated women, Black voters, Latinx voters, AAPI voters, abortion is an extremely important topic to them and something that they really care about and want to see progress made on. The most intensely motivated subgroups, when we think about how abortion leads to motivating their decision to go vote, are Democrats, women, Democratic women, Black women, Latinx women, older women, women who are in the Western region, and college-educated women, so really women across the board. Again, like I was saying, it's a common misconception that women of color are less supportive of abortion access. At HIT Strategies, we do a monthly poll of Black voters, and we had been tracking the how important the issue of abortion is to them and their decision to go vote over time. And you can see it increased in salience the closer that we got to the election, with 73% of Black voters in October of 2022 saying that it was an important issue in their decision to go vote. For low propensity voters as well, abortion was a big factor in their decision to go vote, and they want to see Democrats fight hard to protect abortion access. We saw post-election, a lot of the states where abortion was front and center, like Michigan, that we saw big turnouts among our Democratic base. And so I think it will be very important going into 2024 to find a way to connect the elections with this idea of protecting abortion access for everyone in their state, or in different localities or congressional districts. The more that voters feel that their decision to go vote is connected to making change on these big issues, the more that they will be willing to turn out to go vote. And it's not just about abortion access exclusively. In this poll that we did with Urge in 2022, it was about kind of the slippery slope, healthcare, autonomy, and other rights that they also view as being on the line with the ripple effects of overturning Roe v. Wade. So it doesn't just have to be about purely abortion access, though it is an incredibly motivating factor for people to go vote. It could be about them personally losing access to contraceptives, including birth control, IUDs, the general slippery slope that could occur in the environment post Roe v. Wade being overturned. So Democrats really, this is a graph of ad spending in the 2022 election, from Labor Day through the election day. You can see that on the Democratic side, we spent a lot on abortion, and there was really not that much response from Republicans on abortion. We saw in the earlier graph that crime, folks that thought that crime was an important issue, trusted Republicans more on this issue and tended to vote more Republican. They spent 58% of the money for ads focused on crime. Democrats felt the need to respond to these attacks on crime directly, but there were only a couple areas like Los Angeles, Minneapolis, where we were taking a progressive and different stance on crime. A lot of this ad spending by Democrats on crime nationally was more of an agreement with the Republican stance on crime, in that we don't want to defund the police. In fact, we want to increase spending for police to make safer communities. So in that way, we're not giving Democrats or progressive voters a different message, and we're still relying on the fact that they trust Republicans more on this area, and we're not really competing for the narrative in the same way. So moving a little bit into this role of public safety in 2022 and how we improve for 2024, we saw a lot of Republican focus on crime, and while it failed to produce the much anticipated red wave that they thought it would, we think it's primarily because of the impact of the overturning of Dobbs and how that increased Democratic participation on the other hand. But there is a successful progressive message in this space. We don't just have to combat their message of Democrats kind of want this lawless society with no police, with that's not true. We don't want to defund the police. We want to increase police presence. That's not a successful message for Democrats going into 2024. In fact, a successful message for Democrats is one where we talk about addressing root causes of crime, making police do less of the mental health crisis, dealing with homelessness or domestic violence, that type of work. That's a really successful message to use for Democrats. So in this poll that we did with Change Research, we've been researching this kind of public safety narrative for about a couple of years now. And we found that when you ask straight out, do you support or oppose defunding the police? 62% of people in the country oppose defunding the police. But when you just rephrase it slightly to say, do you support or oppose reallocating some funds from the police budget to non-police responses to public safety needs, such as professional teams trained to deal with mental health crises, homelessness, or domestic violence, and programs shown to prevent participation in criminal activity? Here you get a majority of people saying that they support this idea of reallocating police funding. We have also done this type of work in specific cities around the country. So for example, in DC, the DC voters overwhelmingly supported the RCCA that Congress just overturned, when you gave them the explanation of what the bill would actually do for them. Similarly, in Columbus, we saw a super majority of voters in Columbus prefer progressive approaches to public safety. We asked which of these should the city of Columbus prioritize to make communities safer. They said mental health services, more affordable housing, better training for police, job training and economic opportunity, after school programs, alcohol and drug addiction counseling. You'll see that only 23% in the city of Columbus said that they actually did want more police officers. And when we dig into that qualitatively, it's because they don't feel that that will actually make their communities safer, but they want to see an investment into public safety. Again, we did the same type of poll in Atlanta, and we asked, what do you think contributes the most to the cause of escalating crime and violence in your community? Really a plurality here said lack of economic opportunity. They really point to these root causes of crime rather than a lack of police being the problem with crime in their communities. So all that to say, there's just a different way to talk about progressive public safety that we need to start thinking about in our messaging, that our candidates need to start thinking about in our messaging in order to be more successful in 2024, because we know that Republicans, in seeing the success of their crime attacks on Democratic candidates in 2022, are going to come at Democrats again with this next election. So just really quickly to wrap up here, looking at AAPI voters, historically, AAPI voters have been some of the most swingy voters, but it's not necessarily for the reason that you would think. It's not AAPI voters switching between liberal and conservative viewpoints election to election cycle. It's actually because of turnout in the AAPI community. And in elections like in 2014, as we see here in this graph from the New York Times, in elections where AAPI turnout decreases significantly, partisanship swings towards the right. And we saw this again in 2022 in the last midterm election, specifically in New York State. We saw New York State AAPI voters really swung dramatically to the right. But again, it's not a case of growing conservatism. What actually happened here when we went in and talked to these folks qualitatively was, again, they felt like Democrats really weren't paying attention to the issues that were important to them. Some of those issues that were important to them were the economy and inflation, growing concerns about anti-AAPI hate, crime as well. But Democrats in New York State were echoing Republican talking points essentially on crime and asserting that they didn't want to defund the police, but not showing what they would do to improve the situation for AAPI voters and crime. So to wrap up really quickly, in 2020, we found that despite not being contacted by either party, AAPI voters turned out because they felt that Democrats were addressing issues that were important to them, like the coronavirus pandemic and like jobs and the economy. And they turned out because of the threat of Trump and how they felt he was mismanaging COVID. So again, in this election, AAPI voters cared about the coronavirus pandemic. They trusted Democrats to handle the COVID pandemic, and they did not trust Republicans to handle it, while simultaneously feeling that Democrats were addressing issues that were important to them. This was just not the case in 2022. So we saw a dip in turnout among this group in particular. And I think if more investment isn't put into the AAPI community early going into 2024, we're going to see that sustained dip in turnout because they really have been feeling demoralized and demobilized. They feel that they're not being paid enough attention to by Democrats. And if Democrats aren't speaking to them and to their issues, they're willing to sit out and not vote because they really don't see kind of the point in turning out for candidates who don't care about them or aren't addressing their issues. So those are three things that I think, those are three areas that I'm looking at and very concerned about and digging into going into the 2024 elections. I think now I'm going to pass it over to Abby.
Thanks so much, Roshni. Hello, everyone. My name is Abby Kiesa, as Paige said, and I'm a deputy director at a research center called Circle. Circle is part of the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, where we host a number of institutes focused on research for stronger democracy. Stronger and more inclusive democracy. One of the things that I do want to share about Circle is that we are a nonpartisan entity, and so I'll be kind of using a little bit of a different frame than Roshni, but all of our work is about building robust and inclusive democratic participation. There's a lot more data that's available that we have, so I'm going to go through a small slice of it. And actually, we're going to be releasing more data about learning from 2022 this week and next week. So please stay tuned for that. I'm going to turn on my timer so I don't go over. So one of the things that I think is important to frame before we go into this presentation about young people, and is that when you look at who was eligible to vote in the 2022 election, there was 8.3 million 18 to 29-year-olds who were just turning 18, 19 years old for the first time since the 2020 election. So when we think about young people, we got to think that at least like a quarter of young people are in an election for the first time, right? So that's a key piece of thinking about young people. The other thing, this is an overlap with Roshni's presentation, is that almost half of young people who were turning 18 and 19 in between the 2020 and 2022 election were young people of color. And roughly 1/5 to sometimes we think a quarter of young people would identify as queer or LGBT in some form or in some form or another. And so as we think about young people, we have to think about young people who have maybe had trouble navigating systems in the past, right? And that's important to think about as we go into this process. So one of the things that happened after the 2022 election is that two stories emerged. And I want to share a little bit of data about the first story. The first story is that youth voter registration was up compared to the remarkable historic 2018 election. And the turnout in 2022 was the second highest midterm youth turnout in the past 30 years. And that young people, particularly youth of color, were influential in several statewide races. So this is an example, and you don't need to look at all the states, but all the states on the right in the blue columns had youth voter turnout numbers higher than the 2018 election. And the 2018 election was a high watermark for midterms since the 26th Amendment was passed for turnout. So this was notable for 18 to 24-year-olds in the 2022 election. And then we also saw turnout the second highest that it's been for the past 30 years, again, with 2018 as a high watermark. So this is notable that generation, for a number of generations, we've seen low midterm turnout. So two midterm cycles in a row where we've seen a change in that is really important. And then one of the things I think is particularly important to point out is the role that young people played in certain key races across the country. You look at the blue lines here, that's the net youth votes for Democrat, and the green line is the vote margin in these statewide races. And you look at states, like the Georgia Senate race or the Arizona gubernatorial race, where young people, just the net votes for Democrats were far exceeding the vote margin in those places. And so one of the things that this story puts into perspective is that young people, regardless of what you think happened with turnout, cast millions of votes every election cycle. In presidential election cycles, sometimes it's upwards of 20 million votes. So young people cannot be ignored because it's that so many millions of votes. Now, we also have a second story. A second story emerged after the 2022 election. And this story was that, we didn't see a rise in turnout. We didn't see an increase in the youth share. So this is not a substantial story. There's no there. And of course, since we are focused on young people and supporting young people, we have to look at this evenly, both from a research perspective, but also putting this into a larger historical context. And when you do that, we have to see that both of these stories are important to see, are important. And one of the things that we have to say as a result of that is that there is a new normal that's happening, and it's not good enough, right? 27% youth voter turnout is historic, and it's not representative of a robust and inclusive democracy. So there is a new normal amongst youth for youth engagement. And you can see here that this holds for things more than voting. But we really have to focus on systemic changes to maintain this level of engagement and increase it. And so for the rest of what I want to talk about what kind of systemic shifts are required and what kind of support for youth leadership is required to help continue these more historic trends. And so what I want to focus on are these four things. One, that experience with what we're going to call small d democratic practices are highly relevant for young people's optimism about democracy, that political homes for young people, homes for civic development, are key parts of that. And political homes can be a location where young people are learning from people who they trust about what, where, when, how to do things like voting and be engaged. And that state voting policies are a critically important context to all of this. So to just jump right in, I want to talk about this relationship between youth engagement, exposure to democratic practices, and political homes. So one of the first things that I think is really important to understand about the 2022 election, and frankly, some of the more recent elections as well, is that midterm participation was higher amidst concern and distrust. Young people, as you can see, have lower levels of trust for lots of different stakeholders in democracy, and young people still voted at higher historically rates. And so this is one thing where we have to be able to hold two things at the same time, right? Concern and distrust and interest in participation. And so this raises up a really practical question for me, which is how do we think about things like enthusiasm? Are enthusiasm and motivation to vote something that we need to nuance a little bit more to understand the current political moment and all of the constituencies that we're talking about? The other thing related to this idea of experience with democratic practices that I want to bring up is that according to our research about young people in the 2020 election, we found that people's views about democracy were actually correlated with their experiences with small d democratic practices. So young people who had participated in decision-making with other people, worked on a community issue with others, expressed their opinion about how to solve a community issue, things like that, were much more likely to think that democracy was working and to have optimistic views about democracy. And this is particularly important because I think that sometimes we think that civic engagement and voting is all this cerebral thing, but sometimes it's about your experiences, right? And exposure to what is it like to participate in democracy. And this is where I want to bring up the political home situation, because these are the type of situations where someone can learn when they are part of a youth group or part of a community-based organization, right? And so that puts into perspective that it's not just messaging, it's not just the nudges that people see on social media, but it's actually what someone could be experiencing now well ahead of the 2024 election, right? So our work starts to keep sustaining a larger youth electorate and expanding it starts now with some of these kinds of experiences. And these experiences are also critically important because young people have been reporting for several election cycles that they would like to participate in elections in different ways, but have not seen those opportunities. So we need to make sure that those opportunities for young people to step into more engagement in elections are inclusive and are welcoming and accessible, right? It can't just be that there's information on a website for someone to participate in something, right? How are they being invited? Making sure that people know that they're included, making sure that someone who they know are recruiting them into something. And so these are things that can happen in a political home, that can happen in a local youth organization or a community-based organization. The other thing that happens in that kind of community-based context, and again, this is from our 2020 data, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it's really important. This is all data about youth of color. And one of the things that we found was that when we looked at the experiences of youth of color in the 2020 election, we found that young people who were contacted by community or youth organizations, local community or youth organizations, were much more likely than those not contacted by those local organizations to be paying attention to the local, to the congressional, to the Senate races in the 2020 election. And so as we think more about what it looks like to support young people to be paying attention across the ballot, these local groups are critically important to helping people in multiple different ways. So now I want to jump to increasing information about what, where, how, when to vote. And the critical piece here is that this is coming from people in young people's, what we would call a microsystem if we're thinking about it from an ecosystem perspective, right? These are coming from people who young folks have relationships with. And one of the key things that we found after the 2022 election through a nationally representative survey of young people 18 to 29 was that information about elections is not remotely ubiquitous, and that it's ad hoc because it depends on who is in young people's network. So a third of young people who did not vote in the 2022 election said that they didn't have enough information about candidates or about where to vote, right? And this was much more likely the case to be for white and Latino youth. And then we also saw about a fifth of youth who weren't registered to vote, who did not register to vote, said that they missed the registration deadline or had trouble with their voter registration application. So we're still dealing with issues of people not having enough information or right information to be able to cast a ballot. And so this is where some of our relationships come in that I think is really critically important, both from local community and youth groups, as well as from people who know a young person, right? That relational aspect of this. And part of this is thinking about this finding that we have from so many election cycles about young people not necessarily feeling qualified to participate, right? This is a self-assessment of feeling qualified. And you'll see on here that young people who are young youth of color, young people who are younger, young people who don't have college experience are all more likely to say that they feel less qualified to participate in politics compared to white youth, older youth with at least some college experience. And most importantly, at the bottom, young people who do not feel or feel less qualified to vote are much less likely to actually cast a ballot. So how can we talk about information and what's the kind of information or what's enough information to be able to participate in democracy? That's a challenge that we face moving into the 2024 election. And then finally, the fourth thing that I want to point out is the importance of focusing on state voting policies and increasing the accessibility of elections, because this is very much a youth experience, a youth issue, as I'm sure you know. So the policy and regulatory challenges to growing voters, as we would talk about it, are immense. And it has to do with what's happening in education environments regarding civic education, but it also has to do with voter registration drives and ballot drop boxes. And so as we have a significant amount of data analysis looking at this, but one of the things that I want to specifically point out is that in our 2022, I actually accidentally deleted it. That's fun. In the 2022 election cycle, in our post-election survey, we saw that young people in states that have online voter registration, automatic voter registration, or same-day voter registration, young people in states with those three policies are much less likely to say that they didn't understand registration deadlines. So one of the basic things that we can do for a robust and inclusive youth electorate is address some of these policy challenges and make elections a lot more accessible, because that is providing a major challenge to making sure that young people, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their family background, their race and ethnicity, or a whole slew of other kinds of experiences, have access to having a voice on issues that affect them, their families, and who they love in their communities. So those are the few things that I wanted to highlight today. We'll have much more about 2022 coming out this week, actually, and early next week. And you can certainly check out the website that our friends have put into the chat for a whole lot more information. So thank you so much. I'm gonna pass it back over to our moderator.
Thank you. Wow. Fantastic presentations and lots of things to talk about, I'm sure. I'm going to let Paige get us started with some crosstalk questions.
Well, one of the things I noticed, and folks will know me, folks who know me know I'm very interested in this, is the discussion or lack thereof around unmarried people in this country, or particularly unmarried women. There are a majority of women who, the majority of women in this country are now unmarried. And what have you seen in terms of your data on unmarried women and, unmarried men? Because marital status is so important in terms of whether or not someone registers and votes and how they vote.
Sorry, I lost my Zoom screen. But yes, I just didn't have time in the presentation to cover everything, but I think that that's such an important point. I think we saw in the midterm elections that non-married women were about a quarter of the electorate, and almost 70% of non-married women voted for Democrats. So they're a big piece of the Democratic base as well. And I think not enough of the conversation is targeted towards their issues and targeted towards their life experiences, especially when we're talking about policy and going into the election cycle. And so I think it's a really important point, and something that in continuing with the theme that I was presenting is really important to focus on messaging to that group in 2024.
Yeah, I'd love to see some of the unmarried women stuff on your future slides, because if you think about what's happening in this country, like particularly, they are the ones that are getting killed by student loans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, thanks. But let me ask another question now that I've been on my soapbox. What was the most, as you think about your presentations, each of your presentations, what was the most striking thing to you about the other panelists' presentation? Roshni, I'll start with you.
Okay, sounds good. I'm not sure if striking is the right word, because I think a lot of the data that Abby presented is really like gels with what we've been learning as well. But of particular note, I thought was the stat that you put up, that 62% of youth say that political views are important to their personal identity.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's just such a point that is like, people refer to younger generations as apathetic and not politically engaged. And so the idea that politics is kind of ingrained in their identity is something that is not often talked about. But I've found that doesn't necessarily lead to increased voting participation, but more different types of what the younger generation consider. You could talk a little bit more about that.
Roshni, you dropped out a little bit there just towards the end, if you don't mind repeating yourself.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just saying that I found that doesn't always correlate with voting participation, but most other types of what they consider political participation, like talking about politics, attending protests, signing petitions, talking online about politics. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this is a great point. Thanks for bringing this up, Roshni, because I think when we look at some of the other data I shared about barriers, about relationships, about spaces to learn about politics, we see a connection here that, there, when people, I say this a lot, so please excuse me if you've heard me say this before, but that when you turn 18, there is no fairy dust. That, all of a sudden you get information in your brain about how to vote and what affordances there are for you to have a voice on issues that you care about. And so as a result, it is entirely about who's around you and the opportunities that you have and the conditions. So I think for some young people, there are people in their network who are going to protests, who are, doing some of these other things, who are volunteering in their communities or at their church or synagogue. And I think that that's something that we have to remember. We have to remember about young people, that they're, and our, Circle Growing Voters report really emphasizes this, that the experiences that young people have learning about elections and knowing about elections is dramatically different across the country. And that is a huge problem that we have for the foundation of democracy that we need to address if we want to have a robust and strong democracy in the future. And that's why some of these systemic differences and systemic changes are critically important. But Roshni, I mean, on this note about, people who are maybe not yet voters, I really appreciated your focus on, quote unquote, low propensity voters. And, I wondered, how are you thinking about the importance of that group going into 2024?
That's a great question. And I think that they're so important because we saw when they were these technically low propensity voters that we saw get incredibly engaged in 2018 and 2020 to what seemed like a reaction to Donald Trump, but was also a real engagement with what was going on around the country in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Those were all really engaging and mobilizing things that got that kind of lower propensity voter that we were thinking about to the polls in 2018 and 2020. And so thinking about 2024, there's no, we have to find something that engages them as much as that. And so if we can find a way to tie the issues that are really important to them into not just policy promises, like if you turn out and vote, we will do X, Y, and Z for you, but into like, here is why this matters for you. Here is why your member of Congress is important in this fight. Here's why your senator is important in this fight. Here's why your local elected officials are important in this fight. If you really care about this, it's important that you come out and do something like just a different type of messaging and engagement with these low propensity voters to get them. It's a different type of persuasion, basically. We're not saying it's Democrats versus Republican, but we're saying here's why it's important for you to turn out and vote. And here's why it matters to the issues that are most important to you. And then they make that connection. These low propensity voters tend to be non-college voters of color, younger voters of color, younger non-college women. And these low propensity voters tend to share progressive values and beliefs. So when we just point them towards elected officials and what elected officials can do for them and their lives and livelihoods, like Paige was saying, these groups are often the most affected by some of the economic policies in our country, but don't feel like they have a voice in a lot of the policy fights that we're talking about. So just reframing the way that we're talking to them about the importance of elections can help to mobilize some of those voters.
Thank you both. We're going to take some questions from the audience. Ben is wondering if there is a segment of young voters that performed differently than you expected in 2022. And I'll give that half to you, Roshni. And then the other half of that question would be a great one for you, Abby, which is there anything we can learn from that? So let Roshni go first.
Yeah, I think if a segment of young voters that I think performed, I wouldn't say differently than I expected, but I think differently than we expected generally. I would say definitely young Black men who seem to be trending more towards Republicans for economic reasons, but it's just because they're not hearing Democrats again addressing the issues that they feel are important to them in a way that connects with the issues for them. So we're seeing more and more young Black men and young Black voters generally voting for Republican candidates. And it's not because of a shift in values or a shift in ideology necessarily. It's really a shift in that communication gap of them not hearing from Democratic candidates on issues that they feel are important to them and speaking their language.
Yeah, and I think that this goes back to something that I talked about with respect to contact, because this is one of those things where I think we talk a lot about messaging and what message matters. And I know that there's a lot of conversation about relational organizing, which is really important. And I think that it's just as important when talking to young people, maybe more important when we're talking to young people about, information coming through relationships, because of being new to the system, right? Being new to the system and coming of age in the system when, we have so much political turmoil happening, right? And every election cycle feels like the most important election cycle, right? And so how do you make sense of all of the information when you're brand new to everything, right? And everything feels so critically important. And so that's why some of these spaces for young people to think with others, right, and not be a transactional relationship, I think are critically important as we think about 2024, when there's going to be an overwhelming amount of information for people to go through, and misinformation and disinformation to sift through. So I think that is one of the things that we're really thinking about, those opportunities that young people will have over the course of the next 18 months.
Thank you both. So this question is one that I've been asking every webinar this year, which is, what is it that we're not asking, particularly when it comes to emerging voters? We've actually heard a big theme about relationship building, communicating with voters, and how much of a difference that makes. And that in many ways is a little bit disruptive to the current political system. So what are some things that you want to challenge people to think about as they gear up for the upcoming election and the ones after that?
I would say definitely early investment in messaging and outreach into some of these lower propensity or Democratic based communities. We hear over and over again in focus groups with young people, with people of color, the Democrats don't reach out until Labor Day of an election year, and just expect them to show up. And this, but what actually does help them show up and what helps increase their political efficacy is candidates or organizations talking to them throughout the year about, thank you for voting. Here is what your mayor just passed to help make your life better. Thank you for voting. Here's what your congressperson is doing in Congress right now because you turned out to vote. They're supporting your community. That type of messaging is invaluable among these lower propensity voters to make them feel that sense of political efficacy. And just having more investment earlier on to make them feel more connected to the political process, I think is something that we shall strive for.
So sorry, I was just going to recap a drumbeat of appreciation and outcomes. Yeah. Abby, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think this answers one of the other questions that was asked about, strongly Democratic states and what to do with House races, right? When you're not talking about statewide. And as I think this is highly relevant to what Roshni was saying. Like, are people hearing from you at all? Are they hearing from a congressional campaign? Do they know anything about the congressional candidate? And are they finding anything out about them, well before, if possible, well before the actual election? And I think that makes it really, it makes, I think a great way of talking about this is, are you parachuting into a community, right? Or are you investing in what's happening there, right? For the longer term. So I think that's where, as Roshni was saying, investing now can have, even though it's, kind of a longer term focus, has both longer term influences and the short term kind of wins that people are looking for, because there's a infrastructure there. And that's one of the things that I think we've seen in the youth space has been critically important, which is the states where there are, youth groups holding things down in states, being a regular drumbeat of information, being a civic information source for young people, right, outside of news sources, is a critical piece to maintaining that level of conversation and maintaining higher levels of engagement. And we usually see that, in some of the more competitive states, but when you look at some of these other states, it's also important too, if you want to have, higher turnout, especially amongst young people.
You know, I want to emphasize one of the points. In other work I did, it is very clear that voters know little about their member of Congress, and the lack of knowledge increases as you go down ballot. One of the things I think that some members or elected officials should do, which is a missing link in the messaging or their public service, is they talk about what was passed, the policies that they think will benefit one's life, but they don't really, except for the child tax credit, they don't really tell voters how to access those benefits very, very clearly. And so you get caught in this labyrinth of systems that it becomes a little onerous for people to figure out how to, take advantage of the benefits that are being passed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's so easy to use the same methods of communication that you do during the election. Click here to access your voting information. Click here to access who's on your ballot. Click here to access your polling location. Like, why can't we have that same type of messaging to say, we passed the child tax credit, click here to access information about it and how you can benefit from this policy. That type of messaging is really beneficial.
Yeah, it's like who you vote for, public policies they pass, and how you benefit. That connection, I think, is important because it shows, that the elected officials care. Do we have any more questions?
There's two questions. They're both for Roshni, but I think they are in keeping with this theme of what is it that we're talking to people about. So I'm just going to read them out. And then Abby, I think I'd love to hear from you as a sort of closing statement about the key takeaways of Circle's research on messages that resonate. And Roshni, these questions are in the Q&A. I'm sure you have had a chance to read them, so I'll just sort of recap them. One was to ask a little bit about the message testing you all did last cycle, and then Sandy's got a question that's specific to the message around defunding the police and what message does resonate with folks there. So Roshni, we'll start with you, and then Abby, and then Paige will close it out.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I was trying to type responses to these, but they got quite long. So I'm glad that you brought it up. But we've been doing a lot of message testing at HIT on the issues that I brought up, and I think we found some really compelling progressive messaging that works to engage some of these lower propensity voters and engage the Democratic base voters in a different way from just saying, Democrats are promising this, Republicans are promising this, but rather what we're going to do for you to make your lives better, why it's important to vote, the kinds of messages that we've been talking about for the last hour or so. But thinking about the defund message specifically, voters really have a hard time of conceiving of where new funds for things are coming from. And so often when you just present a message to them in this way, where it's defund the police or reallocate funds, it is like a kind of zero-sum funding matrix for voters who don't think very deeply about policy, economic policy and funding, and where funding for policies are coming from. And so that is why it focuses on reallocating. But I will say that voters do acknowledge that there are deep issues with policing in the country today. And so framing this as reallocating, not only taking money away from police, but taking away key responsibilities that the police should never have been granted in the first place, and funding organizations that should be responsible for those responsibilities instead, is really compelling messaging.
Yeah, and thanks so much for the question, Patricia. I think one of the things when we're thinking about messaging around young people is to think about who you're speaking to, right? And who you're targeting, because not all young people have the same foundation of information that you may assume. And I think that that's one absolutely critical thing for people to think about, right? the other things that I'm thinking about is, last year we did an interesting kind of messaging project with Action for the Climate Emergency. And one of the things that really came out of it was that locally focused messaging was really compelling related to climate. And that was pulling people who were lower propensity engagers more into the conversation compared to, some of the other messages. And then one of the things, and Roshni was talking about this in the beginning, about connecting, voting to change on big issues. That's one of the things that we've been seeing for years, which is that young people really want to see change on these huge issues that are facing, our country and the globe. And that is one really compelling piece that, we saw really strongly in 2018 and 2020 that young people were doing themselves, is connecting voter registration and voting to these issues, right? And the specific impact that could be had in those elections on those particular issues. And all of these things, thanks so much, Patricia, for sharing it, are part of our sort of broad framework for building robust and inclusive youth engagement, which we call Circle Growing Voters.
I want to close by thanking the panelists and thanking the audience for some interesting questions and discussion. And I really appreciate your time and your smartness.
Thank you so
See
much.
you next month.
Thank you so much.